Tifauge Castle, western France. Super-rich nobleman Gilles De Rais has just had Jean, a young orphan boy, escorted into his private rooms.
Imagine a man who was once a hero of the battlefield, admired by everyone for his bravery and honor, suddenly becoming the greatest fear for his own people. Gilles De Rais, once celebrated and respected across the land, yet behind that fame hid a story so dark it could haunt your dreams. He was the same man who fought alongside Joan of Arc, stood beside her as the king received his crown, and made a name for himself in every battle. But within a few years, the hero slowly became a threat to innocent children. People were so caught up in his wealth and reputation that no one noticed the darkness growing within him. Think about it. How does a man, seen by all as a saint, slowly bring darkness into his own life? Was it grief and loneliness? Or did power and privilege awaken another side of him entirely? In this story, we will take you inside the secret chambers of Gilles De Rais, where the line between hero and villain was only a breath away. And by the end, you'll see how the most dangerous people are often the ones standing right in front of you, wrapped in honor and respect. The making of a hero. Gilles De Rais was born in 1405 into one of the wealthiest families in France. From the very beginning, life seemed to hand him everything on a silver platter. Vast estates, noble blood, and influence that could rival kings themselves, all before he even reached his teenage years. Most boys his age were learning simple trades, but Gilles was learning strategy, warfare, and leadership, preparing for a life far beyond ordinary. When his parents passed away, young Gilles inherited a fortune that made him untouchable in society. But wealth alone wasn't enough. He craved recognition, glory, and a place in history. By 16, he had thrown himself into the 100 Years' War with unmatched zeal. He wasn't just another knight, he had a talent for battle that left even seasoned commanders in awe. Then came 1429, a year that would change everything. Joan of Arc appeared, claiming divine guidance to crown the king. While many nobles dismissed her as a peasant girl with foolish ideas, Gilles saw potential. He pledged his support, his wealth, and his army to her cause. Together, they fought in battles that shaped the future of France. He was at Orléans when the siege was lifted, and marched beside her all the way to Reims. By the time Charles VII received his crown, Gilles stood beside him, celebrated as one of France's greatest knights. At 24, he had everything medieval society admired: wealth, honor, and the blessing of God himself. But this rise, this glory, would soon collide with tragedy, setting the stage for a darkness no one could have imagined. The triumphs of Gilles de Rais didn't last long. In 1430, Joan of Arc was captured by the English, and a year later, she was burned at the stake. Her death struck Gilles like a lightning bolt, shattering not only his faith, but also the purpose that had driven him for years. The knight who had once charged into battle with unwavering courage suddenly withdrew from public life, retreating to his sprawling estates. Alone in his castles, surrounded by servants and wealth beyond measure, Gilles began to change. His days were filled with extravagance and obsession. Lavish banquets, costly entertainments, and elaborate performances consumed his time and fortune. But beneath these displays of wealth, something darker was growing. He started collecting rare books on magic and the occult, hiring alchemists and supposed sorcerers. Not because he needed money, the man was already rich beyond measure, but because he seemed desperate to fill the void left by Joan's death. Locals whispered about strange lights at night and unsettling sounds coming from his castles. What had once been a home of power and prestige now seemed haunted. People spoke in hushed tones about the rituals Gilles conducted in secret chambers, hinting at obsessions that were far from innocent. This was the turning point. The celebrated knight of France, once a hero of the battlefield, was slowly becoming consumed by isolation, grief, and a dangerous curiosity. The man who had stood beside a savior was now stepping into shadows that would eventually claim the lives of the innocent. After retreating into his castles, Gilles De Rais's life took a darker turn. At first, it was small things, children from nearby villages disappearing. Families sent their sons to work in his estates, hoping for steady wages, perhaps a chance at a better life. But some children never returned. Servants gave vague explanations, saying the boys were sent elsewhere or had found new opportunities. Locals began whispering, uneasy about strange lights and sounds coming from the castle at night. No one dared question Gilles. He was still the celebrated war hero, a man with immense wealth and influence. Nobles and officials looked the other way. Who would confront a knight who had fought beside Joan of Arc herself? But the disappearances weren't random. They seemed deliberate, often involving boys between 8 and 12, sometimes with delicate features or fair hair. Gilles' obsession with controlling his surroundings and finding something or someone kept growing. What began as small, unexplained events slowly formed a pattern, hinting at the horrors lurking within his castle walls. Neighbors spoke in hushed tones about children who entered the estate but never came out, while servants began reporting odd rituals and secret gatherings. The air around Gilles' property felt heavy, tense, almost alive with whispers of fear. This was no longer a hero grieving a lost friend. It was a man stepping fully into darkness. The first signs of horror were subtle, yet deliberate, and the stage was set for the tragedies that would soon define his name in history not as a knight, but as something far more terrifying. As time passed, the disappearances around Gilles' estates became harder to ignore. Villagers began noticing a disturbing trend. The children taken were not random. Most were boys between 8 and 12, often fair-haired or delicate-looking, as if Gilles was drawn to specific traits. What had started as isolated incidents was now forming a pattern, a chilling sign that something far more sinister was taking place inside the castle walls. Gilles' servants were often complicit, either out of fear or loyalty. They carried out errands for him without question, bringing children under false pretenses, promises of work, education, or a better life. Parents, desperate for opportunities for their children, trusted these offers, unaware of the danger waiting behind the castle doors. Inside, the atmosphere of the castle changed. Servants whispered about strange rituals and private chambers where Gilles spent long hours in secrecy. The hero of France, once celebrated on the battlefield, was becoming a predator in his own home. His wealth and status protected him, creating a veil that hid his dark obsession from the world outside. Even among those who suspected the truth, fear kept them silent. How could anyone confront a man who had fought beside Joan of Arc and earned the trust of kings and nobles? The pattern was clear now, and the tension was mounting. Gilles' obsession was growing, and his control over the children was methodical, deliberate. The stage was set for a series of horrors that would shock even the bravest minds of the time. The hero had crossed the line, stepping fully into a darkness that could no longer be ignored. Inside Gilles De Rais' sprawling estates, the atmosphere had shifted from grandeur to unease. Rumors of secret chambers, hidden passageways, and unexplained rituals began to circulate among the few who dared to observe. Servants spoke quietly of rooms locked at all hours, strange symbols painted on doors, and eerie noises echoing through empty corridors late at night. What had once been a home of wealth and celebration now felt like a fortress of fear. Gilles moved with a precision that suggested he had thought through every detail, every corner, and every potential witness. The children who entered his castle were never truly seen again. Servants, bound by fear or loyalty, carried out his orders without question, bringing victims under false pretenses. Neighbors began noticing patterns in the disappearances. Certain days, Certain families, even specific traits in children, seemed to attract Gilles's attention. The castle, once a symbol of his power and honor, had become a place where shadows ruled. Lights flickered at odd hours, distant cries or perhaps echoes of old fear carried through the corridors, and the air seemed heavier, almost alive with secrecy. The castle's secrets were no longer hidden by mere rumor. They hinted at a systematic obsession, a careful orchestration of events that revealed the disturbing shift in Gilles' character. The man who had stood beside Joan of Arc was now orchestrating horrors within his own walls, shielded by wealth, power, and the silence of those too afraid to speak. The hero's legacy was beginning to crumble, replaced by something far darker, an invisible hand guiding him toward unspeakable acts that would leave a permanent mark on history. As Gilles De Rais' obsession deepened, the horrors within his castles grew more deliberate and chilling. No longer isolated incidents, the disappearances of children became part of a methodical pattern. Families who once trusted him now whispered in fear, but the knight's reputation and wealth created an invisible shield. No one dared confront him. Inside the castle, servants recounted unsettling routines. Children were often welcomed with kindness, at first fine clothes, hearty meals, and promises of education or employment. But behind closed doors, the reality was far darker. Gilles's control over the children was precise. Every action seemed carefully planned. Those who entered his chambers rarely returned. Locals began noticing strange occurrences. Doors locked tight at unusual hours, flickering lights, and sounds that made even the bravest uneasy. Servants, fearful of punishment or death, rarely spoke openly, but whispers of secret ceremonies and strange rituals spread among those who dared listen. The transformation from celebrated hero to predator was nearly complete. The man who had once fought alongside Joan of Arc now used his power to dominate and terrify the innocent. His obsession was no longer hidden by wealth or honor. It was visible in the fear that hung over the castle, in the sudden silence of the surrounding villages, and in the growing dread of every parent who lived nearby. The darkest acts were still unfolding, but the pattern was clear. Gilles De Rais, once a symbol of bravery and loyalty, had become a master of fear, orchestrating a nightmare that would soon shock the entire kingdom. Growing bold escalation. Over time, Gilles De Rais' actions grew bolder. What had started as secretive disappearances soon became harder to hide. His wealth and reputation still protected him, but whispers of his deeds spread quietly through the villages. Some servants who had once obeyed without question began to murmur about the strange patterns, the carefully selected victims, and the obsessive rituals Gilles conducted in his private chambers. The children he targeted were no longer chosen randomly. Each seemed to fit a specific preference, and each disappearance was deliberate. Families who had once trusted him were now gripped by fear, though they could do little against a man of such immense influence. Gilles's obsession with control, secrecy, and the occult grew stronger, consuming him day by day. At the same time, his public displays of wealth became increasingly extravagant. Banquets that lasted for days, theatrical productions, and lavish entertainments masked the darkness within, making it appear that the celebrated knight was simply indulging in his fortune. Yet behind every spectacle, there was a calculated tension, a sense that Gilles' obsession had no limits. The hero of France was no more. The man who had fought beside Joan of Arc was now a predator, operating under the cover of power and respect. Each act of cruelty, each disappearance, brought him closer to complete exposure. The invisible line between heroism and horror was disappearing, and soon, the consequences of his actions would catch up to him in ways no one could ignore. Despite his immense wealth, Gilles de Rais' extravagance began to take a toll. Lavish banquets, costly performances, and elaborate shows drained his fortune faster than anyone could imagine. Estates were sold, debts piled up, and the once celebrated knight found himself struggling to maintain the lifestyle that had once elevated him above all others. His growing desperation pushed him to reckless decisions. Loans were taken from the church, lands mortgaged, and when creditors came calling, Gilles responded with defiance rather than repayment. His boldness became dangerous. At one point, he even kidnapped a priest attempting to collect owed funds, a brazen act that directly challenged the church and the nobles who had long tolerated his behavior. Meanwhile, rumors of missing children and secret rituals continued to circulate, but Gilles' influence kept most authorities silent. Still, cracks were beginning to show. Wealth could no longer shield him completely, and allies grew wary of the man whose obsession had become uncontrollable. His carefully constructed image of a loyal, heroic knight was slowly unraveling. Gilles' financial collapse mirrored his moral decay. The same man who had once fought for the glory of France now found himself isolated, both socially and economically. The safety his wealth once provided was disappearing, and with each passing day, the risk of exposure grew. The darkness that had consumed him was about to meet the harsh reality of law, society, and the consequences that awaited any man, no matter how powerful he once was. By 1440, Gilles De Rais had crossed a line that even his wealth and reputation could no longer protect. His reckless spending, coupled with whispers of missing children, had finally drawn the attention of both the church and the nobles. What had been tolerated for years could now be ignored no longer. Gilles was arrested, ending the life of freedom he had long taken for granted. The trial that followed was intense, almost like a medieval spectacle. Witnesses came forward, including servants, villagers, and even some children who had escaped his clutches. They recounted in detail the horrors that had taken place within the castle walls, the systematic abductions, the secretive rituals, and the terrifying precision of his cruelty. Gilles himself gave confessions that shocked everyone in the courtroom. Whether motivated by guilt, fear, or resignation, he described his crimes with a disturbing clarity. Every act, every decision, every horrifying detail of his obsession was laid bare before the court. The evidence was overwhelming, and even those who had long admired him could no longer ignore the truth. Some historians argue that Gilles may have been a victim of political and financial manipulation, a man already in debt and isolated, whose enemies seized the moment. But the sheer number of witnesses and the consistency of their accounts made any complete cover-up impossible. The trial marked the end of a celebrated hero and the beginning of a lasting legend of horror. Gilles De Rais, once a symbol of bravery and loyalty, now faced justice for the darkness that had consumed him and terrorized countless innocent lives. On October 26, 1440, Gilles De Rais faced the consequences of his actions. The once celebrated knight, whose name had inspired admiration and respect, was led to the gallows in Nantes. The crowd that had once cheered for his victories now watched with a mix of horror and relief. Families of the children he had harmed were present, their faces etched with grief and anger. Gilles was hanged and later burned, the authorities ensuring that his crimes would not continue to threaten the community. His final words reportedly included a prayer for forgiveness, though whether it was sincere or merely a final performance remains a mystery. For some, it was a cautionary message about the dangers of excess, obsession, and unchecked power. In the immediate aftermath, France attempted to erase his legacy. Records of his achievements alongside Joan of Arc were quietly minimized, as if the nation wished to separate the hero from the monster he had become. Nobles and church officials sought to distance themselves from the scandal, and stories of his atrocities were often left unspoken, hidden behind official documents and forgotten histories. Yet no matter how much they tried, the story could not be completely buried. Tales of Gilles' crimes persisted, whispered among villagers, remembered in dark folklore, and eventually woven into literature. The man who had once stood at the forefront of France's battles became a symbol of the dangers of power, secrecy, and obsession, a chilling reminder that even the greatest hero can hide a terrifying darkness. Long-term legacy and reflection. Even centuries after his death, Gilles De Rais' story continues to captivate and terrify. France tried to erase him from history, removing his name from records of Joan of Arc's campaigns and avoiding mention of his crimes. But the truth has a way of surviving. Folklore, stories, and later literature immortalized his deeds, shaping the archetype of the dark, hidden villain, someone outwardly respected, yet hiding unspeakable horrors. Gilles' life serves as a chilling reminder of how power, wealth, and status can mask darkness. He was not just a man who fell from grace. He was someone whose obsession and unchecked impulses allowed him to become a predator, while the world applauded his heroism. Modern criminologists even consider him one of history's first documented serial killers, illustrating how certain patterns of manipulation, obsession, and escalation repeat across centuries. The most haunting part isn't just the acts he committed, it's that he looked like a saint while doing them. Every society has figures whose dark secrets are hidden behind respect and influence, waiting for the right moment to surface. Gilles De Rais teaches us that heroism and horror are often closer than we think, and that unchecked power can create monsters in plain sight. So, as you think about this story, ask yourself, how well do we really know the people we admire? How easily could someone hide their darkness behind charm, wealth, or reputation? If you found this story shocking and thought-provoking, subscribe now for more chilling tales from history that reveal the thin line between heroism and horror.